You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, Donald Trump just got some bad news at the hands of a Republican judge. Can you explain what just happened in court?
Yeah, Brian, yet another ruling from a Ronald Reagan-appointed judge who's been on the bench for 40 years, declaring that Donald Trump's executive orders are illegal, unconstitutional, and void. And I'll tell you, I don't know that I have seen a judge go quite so scorched earth in his language on Donald Trump, and I'll get to that in a minute. But Donald Trump issued two executive orders revoking funding for research, and these were with the National Institute of Health, the NIH, for two groups of people, racial minorities and LGBTQ plus folks. And this judge, William Young, a federal court judge up in Massachusetts, not only declared that Donald Trump's executive orders targeting these two groups of people were unconstitutional. But Brian, I'll tell you, I can't do justice to Judge Young's outrage without reading three very short quotes. The first one, the judge says, quote, "I have never seen a record where racial discrimination was so palpable. I've sat on this bench for 40 years now. I've never seen government racial discrimination like this." Quote number two, "I am hesitant to draw this conclusion, but I have an unflinching obligation to draw it that this represents racial discrimination and discrimination against LGBTQ community. That's what this is. I would be blind not to call it out. My duty is to call it out." And one last quote from Judge Young, quote, "You are bearing down on people of color because of their color. The Constitution will not permit that. Have we fallen so low? Have we no shame?" That's some of the choice quotes from this Reagan-appointed judge about Donald Trump's unconstitutional executive orders.
How unusual or unorthodox is that kind of language from a judge, notwithstanding the fact that he was a Republican-appointed judge, and so it's going to be difficult for the party of Reagan to be able to circle that square. But just in general, how often do we see that kind of language?
Brian, it is extraordinarily rare. For 30 years, I appeared before judges in the military, in civilian courts, in state courts, in federal courts, in trial courts, and in appellate courts. And people may not know, in the courts of Washington, D.C., not only are all of the federal court judges appointed by the president, but the 65 judges who sit on D.C.'s local court, the Superior Court for the District of Columbia, are also all presidentially appointed judges because D.C. is a federal city and not a state. I have probably appeared before more federal court judges than almost anybody else. I mean, I can't prove that empirically, but it's pretty damn close. Judges don't talk this way. Yeah. Even when lawyers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, civil practitioners make outrageous claims or outrageous arguments, judges don't talk this way. They're thoughtful, they're measured, they're circumspect. Even the most irascible judges tend to kind of pull back a little bit. They don't use language like that. But when you have a veteran of the federal courts for 40 years who says, listen, this is my duty. It's my duty to call this exactly what it is, blatant racial discrimination by our government, by the Trump administration, and blatant discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community. You know, what has pushed him to do that, just as other judges have done, is just how brazenly unlawful and unconstitutional Donald Trump's conduct is.
Do we have any indication as to whether Trump is going to appeal this ruling, or is there some concern that if he appeals it and it's upheld at an appeals court, then it becomes precedent that could have some impact on future executive orders?
You know, Brian, based on what we're hearing from some of the White House spokespeople, I am certain they're going to appeal it because they're spewing out the same old garbage. Oh, this judge is biased. This judge is using his own political views and ideology to attack Donald Trump. which kind of makes no damn sense given that he was appointed by Ronald Reagan. So
I mean that's something that they throw out every opportunity they get. They claim that Robert Mueller and his team of Robert Mueller, a lifelong registered Republican, and his team of Republican prosecutors was just a band of angry Democrats. So
yeah, which is insane. I mean, Bob Mueller was my homicide chief for 2 years, and I worked shoulder to shoulder with him every day. The man was a Republican through and through, but he did not let politics interfere in his prosecutorial work. But, of course, every judge that rules against Donald Trump, and they're ruling against him by the estimate of one political scientist from Stanford, 96% of the time, they are not only Republican-appointed, Democrat-appointed judges, but they're Trump-appointed judges. All Donald Trump and his mouthpieces have is to attack them as lunatics and deranged, which really, I don't even know that fools the gullible at this point.
So in terms of next steps here, this executive order was declared null and void. And so what happens next? What happens to the funding that was stripped away? What happens to the people who worked on this issue that were fired? I mean, where do we go from here?
That's a great question, Brian, because not only did Judge Young declare that this was illegal and unconstitutional, so they were null and void, he also ordered NIH to immediately restore the funding to these two programs. So that is, I'm sure, something that not only will the Trump administration want to appeal, but they'll want to file for an emergency stay. How many times have we danced this dance? And, first, Judge Young will have the opportunity to decide whether he wants to stay or pause his own ruling. I'm suspecting he won't. And then Trump will run up to the appeals court and ask the appeals court to put a temporary, even if only administrative, stay, which has nothing to do with the sort of quality of Judge Young's ruling. It's just sort of a temporary hold while the appeals court gets to decide the issue. So I am sure that, we've seen this movie before, and I'm sure that is the way this one will play out as well.
Is there any indication as to whether we would see a stay granted at the appeals court in very much the same way that we're seeing that happen in other cases? For example, in California, when Gavin Newsom and the Attorney General out here sued the Trump administration for federalizing the National Guard and sending in the Marines, Judge Breyer, I believe it was, granted that temporary restraining order. That was stayed by the appeals court. And so do you have any idea as to whether what goes into account when they determine whether or not they're going to stay these decisions by trial courts?
Brian, I'm going to say, unfortunately, a pattern is emerging. It is no sort of small potatoes when a trial court judge issues this kind of a sweeping condemnation and ruling when it comes to executive orders of a president of the United States. I mean, it's kind of a big deal in legal circles. And I think most appeals courts get a little bit weak in the knees, even if they read the opinion, whether by Judge Breyer in the California National Guard case or Judge Young in the case we're discussing now. They are kind of loath to let it stand because it is of such sweeping consequence. So, I think the pattern that we have seen emerge is that the judiciary likes to be circumspect in the way they approach this issue, and they kind of want to be on the firmest possible footing if they're going to let these trial court orders go into effect. So I suspect we're going to see that happen again.
Well, I presume some of that is the result of the longtime deference that these judges have paid to the Department of Justice, because usually the Department of Justice acts in good faith and oftentimes doesn't even take cases that it's not going to win. But in this case, when we're seeing a Department of Justice and an administration that has so quickly burned through all of its goodwill by virtue of all the illegality and corruption that they're trafficking in, does that change the calculus a little bit for these judges, where instead of kind of the default position being deference to this administration, now they have to think about the fact that this administration is not acting in good faith and is trafficking in so much illegality that maybe deference should be paid to the folks who fight against this administration?
I think the answer is yes. I think the Department of Justice, as you said, has squandered its good faith. The judges ordinarily will look at federal prosecutors and believe that they are acting in good faith. They have the evidence to back up the assertions they make in court. They have the law on their side. They actually are taking care not to trample over the rights of the people that are enshrined in the Constitution. They have squandered that you know? And just as the Department of Justice ordinarily runs around pounding its chest that they, win 99% of the time, albeit in criminal cases, they talk about having a 99% conviction rate, even in civil matters. The Department of Justice wins in the overwhelming majority of the cases. But when you start going into court as a DOJ lawyer and making just purely bullshit arguments, and the judges see right through them, your goodwill is gone. And when you're losing 96% of the time, that has to impact the way a judge will sort of approach each case when it has to do with an allegation of Trump administration illegality.
And finally, let's finish off with this. We know that the issue at hand here are health-related grants. And so obviously there is some degree of urgency in making sure that this is restored, or at least that this whole process is litigated and adjudicated in some timely manner. And so do you have any idea of how long this is going to take before we have, some decision on next steps here?
Yeah, and Judge Young actually made a comment that, this impacts the health of two populations in a discriminatory manner, minorities and the LGBTQ plus community. So I have a feeling we're probably going to see within about 24 hours the Trump administration seeking both a stay and filing a notice of appeal. Usually, there are different time frames to file notices of appeal. Usually it's about 10 days, sometimes it's 30 days, but I don't think the Trump administration is going to wait around. We're probably going to see something filed as early as tomorrow.
Okay, well, first of all, be on the lookout for the Trump administration attacking yet another liberal, communist, Marxist judge that was appointed by Ronald Reagan, basically the father of the modern GOP. But with that said, we will, of course, stay on top of this case as it continues to play itself out in the courts. For those who are watching, if you'd like to follow along with this case and other legal news, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. That's the best way to support our work and the best way to support independent media more broadly. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.